Rasmussen, there's so many different places we could begin, but on reflection, there is actually one country which has, in a sense, dominated the geopolitical headlines for the last year and a half, and that's Russia. I'm going to ask you a very straightforward question. Are we in a new Cold War?
Well, there are similarities. There are also differences. Obviously, the difference is that you don't have a communist camp versus a capitalist camp. Today, almost everybody considers themselves capitalists, even the Chinese, although with a socialist touch. But you do have Russia as what I would call a geopolitical spoiler, exercising coercion, very much the Soviet style. So that's why there are also some similarities between the current situation and the Cold War.
Well, you labeled Russia a geopolitical spoiler. What should have NATO done that it didn't do that could have maybe not had you making that label?
Well, also seen retrospectively, I think we have done the right thing. Sometimes I have even been asked if we were a bit naive to try to include Russia in our Euro-Atlantic security architecture. Because the fact is that we have done a lot to reach out to Russia. I can tell you back in 1997, we adopted a joint NATO-Russia document called the Founding Act, and one of the more visible initiatives in that Founding Act was to allow Russia to establish a kind of embassy, a permanent representation in the middle of NATO headquarters in Brussels. It grew to becoming the second largest representation next to the United States, but it was a confidence-building measure, and in 2002, we established something very special, namely a NATO-Russia Council, to act as a framework for consultation and joint decisions. So I think we have done what we could to include Russia in a constructive partnership.
What do you wish you would have known then that you now know in terms of Putin, his psychology?
Well, I have met President Putin on several occasions and concluded that the best approach to the Kremlin is to demonstrate unity and cohesion within the Western Bloc and maintain a firm stance, because that is the language that is best understood in the Kremlin.
Now, that could be interpreted different ways. There was basically a coming together over sanctions because of what they've done in Crimea and Ukraine. Now we have Russia at the invitation of Assad in Syria, and that's complicating what's going on there. What do you think, besides keeping Assad in power, what game is Putin, for lack of a better word, playing in Syria and what's happening in Turkey?
Yeah, there might be some side motives, but of course the primary goal of the Russian engagement in Syria is to save the Assad regime. And I agree with you, that has complicated the whole situation, because you cannot fight Islamic State and at the same time save the Assad regime. The Assad regime is not a bulwark against Islamic State. On the contrary, the brutality of the Assad regime fuels the recruitment of fighters for Islamic State. So the primary goal is to save the Assad regime. Now, Russia may have some side motives, one of them being to send a clear signal to Turkey that a no-fly zone is a no-go policy. You may know that Turkey has advocated the establishment of a no-fly zone near the Turkish border as a refuge for Syrian refugees. But Russia has now sent the clear signal through the violation of Turkey's airspace that if you are to exercise a no-fly zone, there is a clear risk that you will have to shoot down Russian aircraft, because we preserve the right to fly everywhere. And that would, of course, dangerously escalate the whole conflict. So that might also be a motive.
So there are a couple potential triggers where this could escalate further. One is Turkey, which is a NATO member. Another is if there was an escalation ladder out of Ukraine into the Baltics, all right? Have a lot of people sitting in this audience from Eastern Europe, who are quite nervous, What probability do you assign that Putin would make an incursion beyond Ukraine or in Turkey? I.e. that would trigger some NATO response militarily.
Well, it is, of course, a matter of concern, in particular after witnessing the Russian aggression against Ukraine. It is a wake-up call, a reminder that we cannot take security and stability in Europe for granted. And there is a clear risk that Russia might proceed to other fronts, including the Baltic states, because the Putin doctrine states that Russia preserves the right to intervene in other countries to protect what they consider the interests of Russian-speaking communities. And that's, of course, a matter of concern, in particular in Estonia and Latvia. Now, you ask me about the risk of an open conflict. I think, thanks to their membership of NATO, the Baltic states are protected against an open Russian attack, because an open attack against the Baltic states would lead to an invocation of NATO Article 5, the famous solidarity clause that we would consider an attack on one, an attack on all.
No, I understand that, and I understand Article 5, all right? But my question is, how likely is it that Putin would make this type of confrontation that would trigger a response with NATO, be it either in the Baltics or in Turkey?
Yeah, but I gave you the clear answer.
No, you didn't.
That the
You didn't.
that the probability is very low, thanks to their membership of NATO. But having said that, I think there is another risk with a higher probability, and that is what we would call hybrid warfare. What we saw in Crimea, this combination of small green men and sophisticated propaganda and disinformation campaigns, intimidation of Russia's neighbors. And we have seen such intimidations. We saw the abduction of an Estonian officer last year. We saw the detention of a Lithuanian ship. We have seen numerous violations of Baltic airspace. So these examples of intimidations represent a higher risk.
So what is the best way that the West should deal with Russia? And how do you see the events we're now seeing in Syria playing themselves out ultimately?
Well, I think, as I indicated, that the best way to address Russia is to keep a firm stance and demonstrate unity and cohesion. And
but that's
firm
not
stance,
stopping Russia.
No, well, I think it will. A firm stance includes militarily that we enhance the territorial defense of NATO allies. And that's exactly what we have done. Through the establishment of a spearhead force, a very rapid reaction force that can be deployed to a NATO ally if someone were to attack a NATO ally. It also includes, on the economic side, tough economic sanctions. And I would say, if Russia continues to destabilize the situation in Ukraine, time has come to consider a further strengthening of sanctions. And finally, the right way to address Russia would also be to help Ukraine economically, as well as building a better capacity to defend herself.